Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and in today's lesson we're going to be discussing verses from the book of Proverbs which explicitly mention the word wisdom. Now, in a certain sense, the entire book of Proverbs is oriented towards wisdom. It falls into the genre of wisdom literature, and it's the literary device of Proverbs consists of a pithy saying of condensed wisdom. But we're going to confine ourselves to a narrative sequence of verses which specifically and explicitly mention wisdom. And we don't have the time to do it all, so we're going to start with what we can and get as much as we can. Beginning in the 6th verse of the 2nd chapter, it reads, "For Yahweh gives wisdom, out of his mouth knowledge and understanding." This is important because all knowledge, wisdom, intelligence, and all the synonyms of that begin and end and originate in Yahweh, who is omniscient, which is the attribute of infinite wisdom. So whatever finite doses of wisdom we can claim, we derive solely from him. So wisdom is the product of submission to the omniscient one. And the next verse we're going to read is chapter 3, 13 through verse 20. This is the most extensive one. We're going to touch upon, "Blessed is the man who has found wisdom, and the man who gets understanding. For the gain from it is better than gain from silver, and its increase than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all your delights are not comparable to her." Now, Solomon was able to speak of this with the authority of experience because he had everything money could buy. He was the wealthiest man in the world of his age, but he was also the wisest, and the things that money can buy are no substitute for the things that money can't buy. No amount of money can buy you prudence, discretion, wisdom, understanding. You can finance an education, but you ultimately cannot pay for a working brain. And so Solomon was just drawing on the contrast between the fleetingness and the vanity of worldly wealth versus the priceless commodity of wisdom, which he also possessed in superabundance. "Length of days is in her right hands, riches and esteem in her left hand." Now, having wisdom can not only add life to your years, but years to your life, so it increases the quality of life as well as extends the quantity. "Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace." Now, this seemingly contradicts some of his more mature musings in the book of Ecclesiastes, chapter 1, verse 18, and chapter 7, 4. He notes that with the increase of knowledge, grief accompanied simultaneously in proportion to his accumulation of knowledge. And that's because the wiser we are, the more aware of imperfections we are, and we are competent to contemplate forces beyond our power to control. We can only contemplate but not fully understand them. But here he also presents wisdom in a more benign light. It is a source of peace as well as grief. So it's really more it's not so simplistic as to fit into a singular prism. So we just want to acknowledge and combine all that the scriptures and Solomon himself has to say about wisdom. "She is a tree of life to those taking hold of her, and blessed are all who retain her. Yahweh founded the earth by wisdom. He established the heavens by understanding. By his knowledge the depths were broken up, and clouds dropped down dew." So the act of creation was very much an act of love and an act of wisdom. The order and intricacy of the created cosmos reflect the infinite intelligence of an omniscient architect, and it's really marvelous to behold. And he's also compared to a tree of life. Again, it adds years to your life and life to your years. And blessed are those who retain her. Now, of course, wisdom can also, or knowledge rather, can be a curse if not utilized properly. And he covers the relation of wisdom in the creation of the world most extensively in the 8th chapter of Proverbs, which is where we're going to turn to next. We're just going to confine ourselves to the 11th and 12th verse, but I would recommend reading that chapter in its entirety to understand the awesome intelligence of the created order and the process of it. And the 11th verse reads, "For wisdom is better than rubies, and all delights are not comparable to her. I, wisdom, have dwelt with insight, and I find knowledge, foresight." So, like, once more, he's reiterating the superior worth of the priceless commodity of wisdom versus that which is highly marketable and merchandisable, being rubies, semi-precious stones, which are of worldly wealth, but are no substitute for the possession of wisdom. And wisdom is company with insight, knowledge, and foresight. These are synonymous with wisdom. They accompany wisdom. Wisdom is really the combination of all synonyms derived or rooted in intelligence combined. The most simplest and practical and all-encompassing definition of wisdom would be the intelligent use of intelligence. Now, a lot of intelligent people have the resources of intelligence, but they don't have the resourcefulness to utilize it properly, and it can be a source of great curse and misery if not utilized properly in the spirit that is submitted. And the next verse comes from chapter 9, verses 9 through 10. "Give to a wise one, and he is wiser still. Teach a righteous one, and he increases in learning. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Sacred One is understanding." So, on top of the wisdom we have acquired, we are never to settle there or be content with whatever wisdom we've accumulated. We're to use it as a foundation to accumulate more of the same and use the building blocks of the wisdom we've accumulated to lay the structure of higher, analogously higher stories on a skyscraper, with stories being analogous to levels of wisdom. Stories in a building, that is. And righteous one, the natural response is to want more of the same, not to be content to rest on whatever wisdom we acquired yesterday, because it's like an organism. It has to grow. It must be growth oriented in order to survive and flourish. And several points in Proverbs, most originally in verse 1:7, he lays the fear of Yahweh as the beginning of wisdom. So that's the foundational fact of wisdom, is submission and fear, a faithful fear of the omniscient one, who is the source of all wisdom, from which all wisdom we can claim can be derived. And the next verse is 11, verse 2, chapter 11, verse 2. "Pride comes, then comes shame, but with the humble is wisdom." So this is the common format of Proverbs, is an antithetical juxtaposition. It compares and contrasts the ways of the wise, the foolish, the diligent, the lazy, etc., etc. So we have here pride, which is what C.S. Lewis called the vice which leads to all other vices. Pride is not only evil in itself, but it is a host of greater evils, and it is a sin. It was actually the original sin which caused Lucifer to fall. We can read of this in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But humble is wisdom, and the natural response to being wise is to be humbled by the possession of knowledge. It's not to go around and use it to exploit or take advantage of people, but it is not self-advertising, not self-seeking. It's oriented towards others, and it's really a humbling aspect. So with intelligence comes pride, intelligence unbounded by wisdom, which is the key ingredient in order to make wisdom, the utilization, effective and efficacious. So really we're to avoid pride like the plague, and humility is the natural response and state of being and mind of the truly wise. And the next verses are chapter 16, verses 16 and 20, which read, How much better it is to get wisdom than gold, and to get understanding is preferable to silver. Again, he's throughout these verses, we have a laundry list of worldly items of monetary value, of which he did have abundance of, being the wealthiest king of his age, unprecedented wealth, unprecedented wisdom. But he really said there's really no comparison between the things money can buy with the things that money can't buy. And also the 20th verse is, He who acts wisely concerning the word finds good, and blessed is he who trusts in Yahweh. The wise-hearted is called discerning, and sweetness of lips increases learning. Understanding is a fountain of life to him who has it, but the disciplining of fools is folly. The heart of the wise gives discretion to his mouth, and he increases learning to his lips. So we ultimately read more than we initially anticipated, but there is much worth discussing in these verses, beginning with the 20th verse. It's incumbent to act wisely, having the possession of knowledge, because actions are rooted in attitudes and knowledge and training and discipline. And the result is that we will find good and be blessed if we trust in Yahweh, who is the source of our wisdom and subject of our study and worship. And discerning is a quality. Discernment is healthy discrimination. Now, our postmodern mindsets condition us to view discrimination in a unidimensionally negative light, but this is unfortunate because it underestimates its virtuous potentials. We are to discriminate what is harmful from what is beneficial, and that is the discernment, which is a spiritual discipline to be developed and a sign of spiritual maturity. And sweetness of lips increases learning. That's just an analogy for for the pleasantness of accumulating more knowledge. And understanding is a fountain of life. As we've said before, wisdom can give meaning to life, and life without meaning is not worth living at all. Especially once you've found meaning and purpose, you can never revert to the old state of wandering aimlessly and without direction. And disciplining of fools is folly. Now, that's a sure sign of intelligence. A wise person embraces the remedial value of discipline, whereas the fool looks at it as in purely punitive terms and as pain to be avoided, and pleasure is to be cultivated at the expense of discipline, which can actually spiritually mature us. And the heart of the wise gives discretion to his mouth. This is just the natural result and byproduct of having a wise heart. Is the words of our mouth stem from the thoughts of our hearts. And increase to his lips, that means the more we know, the more we have to say that is worthwhile to listen to, that is. And the next verse is 23, verse 23. And it reads, Attain the truth and do not sell it, wisdom and discipline and understanding. So even truth is a priceless commodity whose value is immeasurable in monetary terms. But if it could be sold, you wouldn't sell it because it's too precious to lay hold of and let go of. And it's not something that can be exchanged or bartered as a marketable commodity. It can be acquired through education and instruction and discipline and diligence, but it cannot be purchased like a piece of clothing or a house or anything of material worth. And wisdom and discipline and understanding, those are both byproducts of wisdom, discipline and understanding. And the next verse is verse 28, chapter 28, verse 26. He who trusts in his own heart is a fool, But he who walks wisely is delivered. This is again the antithetical juxtaposition. Now, the human heart, we read, is desperately wicked in Jeremiah 17, verse 9, and our hearts are continually oriented towards evil, we read in Genesis 6:5. So really, the human heart will betray the human who relies on it. We're to seek not anything inside us, but him who is above us. And he who walks wisely is delivered. That means he disregards the natural man's inclinations and selfish orientations, and prefers the counsel of scriptural precept and divine theology. And the final verse we're going to read before we close on is chapter 29, verse 3. He who loves wisdom gladdens his father, but a companion of whores destroys wealth. So the greatest joy and pleasure that a son can give his father is accumulating wisdom and acting on that wisdom. And the opposite is one who's inclined to squander his ill-gotten gain on sensual pleasures. So this reminds us of the prodigal son to lead us all the way to the New Testament, but we ultimately don't have time to touch on that or discuss it. But thank you so much for tuning in. Stay tuned next time, and that's all for today. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.